Welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. This is Mark Hamilton and Mark Daly joining you from a sweltering Pacific Northwest. We are under, I think what they're calling a heat dome or a heat bubble, whatever they're calling it. It's 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 43 degrees centigrade here in Vancouver. We're a little bit inland. We're in a Vancouver suburb called Coquitlam, so we're about half an hour from the water, from the ocean, so it's a little bit cooler there. But the last couple of days have been sweltering. And obviously, I just had to get that off my chest. I'm not complaining. We live in Vancouver. It's dark and dreary and wet 9 months of the year. So when this happens, I'm going to embrace it. But the closest experience I've ever had to heat like this is Dubai. It's the Middle East. Man, how are you holding in? You're 15 minutes away from me up the mountain. I'm sure it's just as hot. What are you guys doing to stay cool this weekend?
Just basically not moving at all. I went out yesterday morning for about a 40-mile bike ride with my brother, and we left the parking lot where we were going to ride yesterday. We left at like 6 a.m. in the morning. We were back about 8:30, 8:45, something like that. And it was decent. I mean, it was still under 30 degrees Celsius, but by the afternoon, by the time the sun came around, it was like, holy smokes, it just absolutely just kicked it up like, order of magnitude of like 3 or 4 or something. And it's been hot in the house ever since. So I'm hiding out in my basement, and we have, unfortunately, unlike yourselves, we don't have air conditioning in the house, but we have a portable air conditioner, which is making parts of the house pleasant enough. So we'll just have to hang in here for a couple of days and hope the extreme heat just disappears and we kind of get back to more pleasant temperatures, because before this it had actually been pretty nice the last week or two. I have to admit, I was really enjoying the end of the spring, the first couple of days of summer, and then yesterday happened and I'm just like, oh my God.
Yeah, totally. And and I was talking to you about this before the show kicked off, but we're very much trying to make up for the summer that we missed last year, partly because of weather and partly because of some other global phenomenon, which I think we're all hoping to put behind us. But our listeners aren't joining us to listen to us talk about weather in part of the world that they don't care less about. They're here to listen to us talk about Formula One. And we just finished watching it. I actually got up and watched it live today because it was already 25 degrees at 6 a.m. Pacific time here in Vancouver. So I got up and watched it live. I thought the race was good. I'm certainly not buying into all the negativity about this race that you're seeing online. I think it's been a unique season where we've had some really compelling, some really competitive races. We haven't really seen a race where the outcome was determined so early, but ultimately this was good. It's Red Bull's home track. Mm-hmm. They've tended to dominate. Obviously, we know Max Verstappen won here in 2018. He won here in 2019. He put in an exceptional qualifying run, and he absolutely led from the start. And I think if you're a Formula One analyst, if you're a fan of Red Bull, even if you're not a fan of Red Bull or Max Verstappen, I don't think you can argue that he and that team didn't do everything right this weekend. And honestly, if the race had gone another 500 meters, another kilometer, they probably would have had 2 cars on that podium. And maybe that's the only thing you can look at ultimately, is that one pit stop that was 4.6 seconds that probably cost them that second podium. But other than that, an excellent race for Red Bull, an excellent race, an excellent win for Max Verstappen. And they continue to build on that championship lead. But unlike a lot of our listeners, and I think a lot of the folks on Twitter that are now arguing that the championship is done, we're only 37% of the way through the campaign. Yeah. We have more than 10 races left. A lot can happen. We haven't seen any reliability issues from Red Bull. That's not going to hold. Do not buy into the narrative that the championship is decided, because I promise you it's not. And I'm not saying that because I don't want everyone to tune out come August, but the championship is far from over.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you hit on a number of really good points there. And I think that we have to put things in a little bit of context, because if you backtrack a week to France, I mean, that was an exciting race. You had Red Bull basically outthink Mercedes on the whole pit stop thing. They didn't react fast enough to bring Lewis in. Then you had Max hunting them down, basically passes him with a lap and a half to go. Today, you see that that Mercedes had learned from some of the mistakes from last week and being a lot more proactive, especially with Valtteri Bottas. They saw that Perez had the bad pit stop, 4.8 seconds, whatever it was, bring the Bottas in immediately the next lap, and that ultimately got them the double podium finish. Sure, it wasn't first and second, it was second and third, but that could be a very crucial result come the end of the season, come the constructors. And I think that after being so critical of them them last week and really putting them on blast for the way that they really hung Valtteri out to dry. I felt, and I know that you did too, the way that they just did not really take his advice to heart about trying to do a second pit stop and then basically being caught out. So it worked out for him. And like you say, another half kilometer, another half a lap, whatever it would have been, and that position would have been Perez's for sure. But really exciting. And there were some other things that happened during the race as well. I think that you have to give Charles Leclerc a big credit for coming back after hitting five cars on the opening the opening third of a lap. It was kind of like a demolition derby or bumper cars. Anyways, he had to go in for a new front wing, and he came out, and Charles finishing seventh in the end, one place behind his teammate Carlos Sainz, who I think they were interesting Ferrari, because I think they certainly got stronger as the race went on. And then a good result for Lance Stroll in the top 10, and 8th Fernando Alonso in the points. Well, heck, I should just run down the race. Let's go through the classification, the top 10 anyways. So we had Max Verstappen winning, Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas for Mercedes, second and third, Sergio Perez in fourth, Lando Norris fifth, Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc sixth and seventh for Ferrari, Lance Stroll and the Aston Martin eighth, Fernando ninth, and Yuki Tsunoda, a good race for him to get into the top 10. And then just outside of the top 10, we had Kimi Räikkönen, Sebastian Vettel, Danny Ricciardo, after a very good race last week, very disappointing in 13th, Esteban Ocon, Antonio Giovinazzi, Mick Schumacher, Nicholas Latifi, and then Nikita Mazepin, the last of the classified cars, George Russell and Pierre Gasly, the only cars that did not finish this race. So let's quickly just look at the driver's standings. In first, still Max, 156 points, 22 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton now. Almost has that insurance of having a race victory in his back pocket. But like you say, we're only 37% of the way through the season. Still a lot of racing to be done. Third now in the championship is Sergio Perez he's had several good races now, and it's good to see him moving up through the Drivers' Championship. He's on 96 points. Lando is fourth with 86, and then rounding out the top five is Valtteri Bottas with 74. Now, in the Constructors' Championship, this is where it looks very weird based on the last basically decade. Red Bull, 252 points, 40 points ahead of Mercedes, who have 212. McLaren, third, 120. Just 12 points ahead of their rivals, Ferrari on 108, and then AlphaTauri rounding out the top five. So a lot of interesting things going on there, and I totally agree with what you're saying, is that the title race is not over. There's a lot of racing to be done. Of course, we're basically in uncharted territories, seeing the fact that Mercedes has now not won a race in, 4 races, which is unprecedented, which is the only word that you can use. And I know that is a completely overused word, hackneyed word from the past year or so, but it is true. We have not seen Mercedes in this kind of a slump, if you want to call it that. I mean, they're still scoring podiums, they're still scoring points. They're not out of touch in either championship by any means, but it is very strange not to see a Mercedes driver on the top step of the podium for this amount of time. And Toto Wolff has basically said the same thing, is that despite the fact that they are not going to develop this car anymore, they're focusing all their resources on 2022. This is a team that is just accustomed to winning, and they've done so for the better part of a decade. And there's too much racing, and considering that it's a Mercedes, is that I would expect at some point that they're going to turn it around. There's more races to be won for them. It's just a question of not if, but when, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand is, despite the spread that we're seeing in the drivers' standings right now, despite the spread that we're seeing in the World Constructors' Championship standings right now, if you flash back and you walk through the calendar so far this year, Bahrain, you could make the argument that Max probably should have won that. Imola, you could make the argument that Lewis, he probably could have won that. Portimao was a little bit back and forth. Spain was close. Monaco, Max won that race, and he won from the starting grid, but ultimately he was only there because of Leclerc's red flag and the fact that they couldn't get the car onto the grid. So that was kind of wacky. Baku, ultimately Max should have won, and then Hamilton should have won, except for an unforced error. Ultimately in France, it came down to the wire. Mercedes could have won if the race was 2 laps shorter, or if they'd gone with a two-stop strategy. Today, to me, is really the only race so far this season where we've seen that dominant performance from start to finish. And I think if you look purely at the championship standings right now, they're a little bit deceiving. It could very much be in either direction. Now, that said, I'm not disputing the fact that Red Bull clearly has some exceptional pace and that power unit's providing that team with more top line power than certainly Mercedes is creating at this point with their power units. But I want to make that point that the championship is closer than we ultimately think it is. And the other thing I want to comment on as well is that if you look at the finishes for Max and for Sergio this year, they've had no reliability issues. There's been no, except for that one Pirelli issue in Baku, which we've talked about to death. They've had a really great string of reliability. They haven't been collected by another car. They haven't been taken into a wall. They haven't had suspension damage because of contact in a corner. They've had a really good, kind of disrupted run of performance so far. That's not going to run the entire course of the season. They're going to have a DNF. They're going to have some suspension issues. They're going to have some performance issues. They're going to have a gearbox failure. Something is going to happen. So I think for Mercedes, why today was so important was, one, they managed to keep both cars on the podium. And I think we'll probably get to this, but Toto speaks to the fact that was damage mitigation. But ultimately, they also grabbed that fastest lap point, which is ultimately something that's very, very important. So I just want to be clear that for those that are listening and are maybe new to the series, don't get dissuaded by maybe what you're reading on Reddit or Twitter. The championship is closer than we think it is.
Yeah, great point, because if you go back to 2016, when the battle went between Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, the two Mercedes drivers, after the first 4 races of the season, Lewis did not get off to a great start that year. He didn't have a great weekend in China, and he struggled a little bit through those first 4 races, and Nico won those first 4 races. And I remember after that 4th race, it might have been China, I can't remember exactly, but I think it was after that race in Shanghai. I seem to remember that one of the journos asked Nico, or made the comment that at this point, or in the history of Formula One, no driver, or every driver that's won the first 4 races of the season has gone on to win the championship. And I remember Nico at the time kind of laughing it off, saying, well, yeah, that might be true, but we're only 4 races into a 20 race season or whatever it was in 2016. And it's true. I mean, if you go and look at the entire course of the year, by the time it did come out down to it, it went down to the wire. It came down to that final race at Abu Dhabi at the end of the year between Lewis, between Nico Rosberg, and at that those last 4 or 5 races, if you remember, Nico was just basically playing the insurance game and just trying not to get, he was just not trying to get into any situation that would put himself in danger. He was not making any risky overtaking maneuvers. He was trying to keep the car within the performance limits and not trying to overstress it or anything like that. And just letting Lewis, if Lewis was going to go on and win that race, for him, it was very much the damage mitigation, playing the long game. It was like, Lewis can win all these games, win all these races. But if I come second and I keep my nose clean, then that's all I need to do to win the championship. I mean, it was a gutsy call, and maybe for some people that want to see sort of end-to-end, start-to-finish racing might have had a bit of an issue with that. But the whole point is, despite that fast start and the 43-point gap in the Drivers' Championship, which is basically double what Max has over Lewis right now, Lewis was still able to close that gap slowly but surely and was there right at the very end of the year. So very much like you said, Mark, I totally agree 100% with your comments that, yeah, okay, Max does have a healthy lead. Red Bull has a healthy lead in both of those championships, but there's a lot of races to go, and anything could happen because, like you say, I mean, the odds are that in a series where things can and do go wrong, at some point it's going to catch up to them. Yeah. All right. I think we're just going to take a quick break here, Mark. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit now, just a little bit more about what we talked about on the top of the show, is just about how Mercedes did listen to Valtteri Bottas. They did heed his advice, and this time they were on point. They called it properly, and they got him in for that pit stop, which like we said, could really make a difference at the end of the season. All right. Well, time for a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment, so please don't go away. We'll be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. And yes, we are talking about the Styrian Grand Prix. We are talking about all sorts of things. I just realized we got a bit of an issue in the live chat. Yes, I seem to have turned on the 360 camera setting. I'm not sure how to turn that off. I guess I'll just have to upload the other video later. So sorry about those guys. No, that's just me trying to get used to the new software and not knowing how to turn it off midstream. So anyways, as we were talking about just before the break here, Mark, Valtteri Bottas last week in France, very vocal, very frustrated. And this was brought up a couple of times during the week. Bottas said that he didn't feel that the outburst that he had, full of profanities, went too far. Toto actually said that it was good to see his driver react in such a way, and he wasn't upset by it by any means or anything like that. And I think that this was good for them to finally, I think, show a little bit of support to Valtteri. I felt that they threw him under the bus a little bit in that whole Monaco thing and that strip wheel nut, saying he didn't get on his on the markings or didn't get into his pit box correctly. I thought that it was I felt that they left him hanging there in France last week, despite the fact that he was saying that they needed to go to that second pit stop and they didn't. So I'm glad from his point of view that today that they did react very quickly, because that was a very un-Red Bull pit stop, that left rear tire. And what we saw with Max's pit stop, I think they nailed it. It was about 2 seconds or maybe just a touch over. Lewis had a good stop for his stop. And then when Sergio Perez went in, it just didn't go all that well. I mean, that left rear didn't come off, and ultimately, like you said right off the top, Mark, that could be that one thing that comes back to haunt them later in the season. But at least for today, disappointing if you're Red Bull and Sergio Perez, and then if you're Mercedes and Valtteri Bottas, hey, you'll take it because you weren't maybe expecting that, and you saw an opportunity, you jumped on it, and it paid off at the end of the day.
Yeah, the other thing I thought was really interesting this weekend was, and I know a lot of our listeners on Twitter had commented on this and we shared some footage, but there was an incident in free practice too where Bottas had spun in the pit lane, which is obviously incredibly dangerous because the pit lane is one of the most vulnerable places at a track in terms of personal safety and personal injury, because there's so many mechanics and crew members running around. And there was an incident in free practice too where in something of a test, Bottas had left the box in second gear, which is unusual because drivers typically leave in first gear. He left in second gear, probably overcompensated from a throttle perspective, because if you're going to start in a higher gear, typically you have to apply a little bit more throttle. Looks like he applied a little bit too much, ultimately span and ended up kind of sideways in the McLaren box. Obviously, the McLaren team were incredibly critical. Bottas ultimately got a 3 grid place penalty for the race, and he got 2 points on his penalty license. But the one thing that I was very cognizant of over the course of the next 48 hours was, how is Mercedes going to respond to this? And is this going to be another opportunity for Toto and team to rip into Bottas a little bit? And to me, it felt like they were a little bit more reserved in terms of their criticism of Bottas in that moment, which I thought was nice, because ultimately that was a dangerous maneuver. It was purely driver error, and they probably had every right to criticism. And I don't doubt that there was some conversation in the garage after that practice session about, hey, what had happened, what had gone wrong, et cetera, et cetera. The other challenge too, of course, and just to be clear, because a couple of our listeners had indicated this as well, it wasn't necessarily just the fact that he had started in second and spun, and obviously it was a dangerous maneuver, but he had also, and you can see this in the footage, putting the car into reverse, which is also prohibited in the sporting regulations, that the car cannot reverse via its own internal mechanism, its own internal gearbox and power. The car has to be pushed backwards. But I thought that was interesting as well, that the team resisted potentially the urge that they may have had to criticize him publicly. And I think for his benefit and his psychology, that was probably a good move, and probably put him in a better state of mind come the race.
Yeah, could you imagine if they did react to that, or they weren't on top of it like they were today, and he lost out on that podium after Sergio had that bad stop? He must have he would have been in a position that, what do I have to do to get some support in this team? What do I need to do to get these guys to show me a little bit of love? So I'm glad that it worked out, because I was starting to feel after last week, I was feeling really frustrated for him. And if you see some of the news that's out there this week about Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton talking about potentially having new deals being negotiated, and it looks like something's going to happen with both of those respective drivers at the teams that they're with now, in Red Bull and Mercedes. The only name that isn't being mentioned right now is Valtteri Bottas, despite the fact that he's been saying quite a bit recently that he wants his status sorted out by the summer break, which, when you look at it, I mean, it's coming pretty quick. I mean, we've got several weeks of intense racing coming up, but that summer break is going to come, and whether or not that's something that that we want to see happen before then, I don't know if it'll happen then or not. Like we talked about in the regular show just a couple of days ago, that it certainly is becoming quite a bit of a distraction. Well, maybe not to the team themselves, because only what they know what's happening when it comes to the contract negotiations, but when it comes to at least from the public point of view, it seems to be dragging on a little bit. Anyways, I wanted to talk now about Sergio Perez and just that podium place that he just missed out on. Sergio says the same thing basically as what you said too. Is he just needed a little bit more, and it just wasn't quite enough. And Christian Horner told Sky Sports, quote, "He drove the wheels off the car today. It was a shame the pit stop didn't go better for him, because he would have maintained the track position pretty easily. But then his fight back was impressive. It was just a second or two on that left rear, and the guys, fair play to them, because they composed themselves, and I had it a 1.85 second stop on the next stop for Max. To rebound under that pressure was fantastic." I think, what did he go on to say? "I think very little details now, just putting everything together will be enough. That's the positive bit, and we'll just be putting everything together at the right time." And pardon me, just mixed up my quotes there. That last quote was actually Sergio Perez just talking about his contract status and what it looks like for the future. But amazing. Christian Horner reckons that pit stop could have been a 1.85 second pit stop, and that is in the aftermath of what we were talking about just a couple of days ago, Mark, and all these new regulations or the measures.
The new FIA technical directive
precisely
to slow down the pit stop in the spirit of safety.
Exactly. When you think about it, I mean, 1.85 seconds, that would have to be a world record. I mean, what is it currently at?
1.82.
182. Okay. I thought it was 192, but I think that was probably a previous one. But amazing that they could have still managed to do a pit stop that quickly. But cool to see. And again, it is amazing. We're sitting here all just shaking our heads saying, oh, they really screwed him up with a 4.8 second stop, like it's the end of the world. I mean, it is just it's a crazy reminder of just how quick and how amazingly fast the world of Formula One is. It's mind-boggling at times.
And I think it also reinforces a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, right? Which is, it really doesn't take a lot to swing a championship one way or the other. It could be a tire failure. It could be a gearbox failure. It could be inclemental weather. It could be a rainy race. It could be a dusty race. There's so many different variables. And like I said, you look at the championship standing, and to your point, the constructors is split by 40 points at this point, which seems insurmountable. But it's when you reverse engineer the calendar so far, and you really look that really, with the exception maybe of Monaco and this race, the races were never predetermined. It was never clear a quarter of the way, 50% of the way, 75% of the way through that race who was going to win ultimately. And, if you look back at Baku, if Hamilton hadn't made that I love that term that you always use, that unforced error in terms of the brake issue on that restart. Obviously, he could be much, much closer. He could potentially be leading the Drivers' Championship. We could have a Constructors, which is only divided by 25 points or 20 points. So little things can swing the championship in either direction. And like I said, we're 8 races into what was originally forecast to be a 23-race calendar. We'll probably still see 22 races. We're 37% of the way through. There's a lot that can change. And ultimately, we know that the pit stop situation is going to create some instability from Hungary onwards. Obviously, the mechanics are going to have to become conditioned. They're going to have to learn to adapt differently and function differently. They're going to have to retrain their muscle memory to adapt to a new way of functioning in the pit, especially when it comes to tire changes. I want to stress that the championship isn't over. And little things like this can make a big difference. And ultimately today, it was the difference between third and fourth and a couple of constructors' points. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, when you start to extrapolate these things, they can pile up very, very quickly. And I think, as Toto said, it was absolutely risk mitigation today for Mercedes. And I think given the fact that Max had so much pace, that he's so familiar with this track and he's done so well here, I think for Mercedes to ultimately secure a second and a third place, I think to bring Lewis in on the second to last lap, give him those fresh tires, let him chase the fastest lap point. I think Mercedes was very, very strategic, and I think they did everything that they could have done in this race as well.
Yeah, just a couple of things there. I think it's kind of funny, like just days after this new technical directive that, in the name of safety, that they could have potentially come close to equaling the world record. So it will be interesting once that does get implemented in Hungary in a couple of weeks, how much that is going to change, how much is going to slow things down. And then further to the point you were just making about how well Max has run on this track over the years. I mean, he's won it 3 out of the last 5 years now, I guess it is now, going back to 4 years, going back to 2018. So it's going to be interesting next week. We're staying here. It's going to be the exact same thing that we saw this week, and it's just going to be the Austrian Grand Prix rather than the Styrian Grand Prix. And we saw this last year as well. And you know what really I think would have made this race interesting is because Max was flying. I mean, he lapped everybody that wasn't driving a Mercedes or a Red Bull, and he was over half a minute in front of Lewis Hamilton. I mean, which is mind-blowing. If we're talking a little bit earlier, just it's mind-blowing in the fact that Max has won 4 races Red Bull's won 4 races in a row now, and Lewis has Lewis and Mercedes haven't been winning these races, but the fact that he's more than half a minute behind Max Verstappen is just something I'm kind of struggling to reconcile and get my mind around. That is huge.
Keep in mind, and I'll caution you, because I think the risk of looking at the race classification and seeing that gap is it looks extreme, but don't forget that
stop.
Big chunk of that, is that pit stop. But that said, it's still 12, 15 seconds, which is huge, right? You think about a car passing the finish line, count to 15, and that was the gap between the two cars at the moment that Hamilton went into the pit. So irregardless, that is an absolutely astronomical number. And I think the other point too, and we didn't hit on this earlier, is it's now been 4 races in which Mercedes hasn't won one of them. We've now had a run of 4 consecutive races without a Mercedes car on the top of that podium or a Mercedes driver on the top of the podium. That's the first time that's happened now since 2013. So we're talking 8 years since we've seen that, which is crazy. But again, to my earlier point, obviously in France, it could just as easily have been Lewis up there, except the strategy went against them. So again, it looks like a run of domination, and maybe it continues. And I'm eating my words by the time we get out of the UK, out of Hungary. But I just want to urge our listeners not to check out on the season, because if you do, I'm sure something exciting will happen and you'll regret not having been a part of it.
Yeah, just to add on to what you're saying there is, add that 15, 20 seconds onto that gap between Lewis and Max because of that late pit stop in order to get that single point for the fastest lap. But when you look at Max and Lewis, Lewis is sort of at arm's length to Max. He just couldn't match him on pace throughout the entire weekend, and especially on Sunday afternoon. But what really was surprising was the difference between the first Mercedes and the second Mercedes, and the first Red Bull and the second Red Bull, and just how far back they were as well. But of course, there were, like you say, I mean, there were pit stops going on and things like that, and guys trying to get that single point for the fastest lap, and the risk-free pit stop basically going in, because they were just that much further up the road compared to where Lando Norris was or the next car behind them. And it's just like, let's go and try and get that single point for fastest lap, because we go in unless something catastrophic happens and the car stalls, we can't get it going, or we have a disastrous situation like we saw with Bottas in Monaco, we can't get the wheel off or on or whatever the case may be. It's why not? So I guess when you look at that, it is, like you say, it's fairly easy to sort of fall in that trap that, I guess this wasn't a very close race. It wasn't. I mean, it wasn't like Lewis was pushing Max or vice versa. And I think, again, like I was saying off the top of the show here, is that you have to take it in context to last week, because last week really was a very exciting finale, and it was a very exciting finish to see Max pass Lewis like he did. And if his tires had just gone off a little earlier, or if he pitted 2 laps earlier, whatever it might have been, just those very, very small margins of things that could have gone wrong or been timed differently. Like you say, it could have been very easily. It could have been Lewis up on the top of that, the top step of that podium.
Let me ask you a question. I
Sure.
don't mean to put you on the spot, but
sure you do, but that's okay.
I do, actually. One of our listeners that actually reached out, and he's like, I would really love to hear from you guys every week on who you think the driver of the day was. Who do you think the team of the day was? So having reflected back on this race in its totality and gone through the race classification and talked about some of the more exciting components, who would you award driver of the day today?
I would give driver of the day to Max, just because he was flawless. I mean, he really did not put a wheel wrong the entire race from start to finish. But I'm going to give a shout out for a runner up would be Charles Leclerc after struggling. Well, I mean, he had a very bad opening lap, like I say. I mean, he ended up back at the racing order, then to finish in the points at the end, and he looked very strong. So I'm going to give him a shout out for runner up. And team of the day, actually, I'm going to go with Mercedes, and just on the fact that they got it right when it came to Bottas's pit stop, reacting on the fact that that Perez had a bad stop, and that's the only difference right there. Red Bull bad stop for Perez. Mercedes were all over it, and that could be one of those deciding factors at the end of the year. Just like we were talking about last week, that second stop for Max Verstappen could be a championship deciding thing. So, it doesn't sound all that great when the team principal is calling it damage mitigation and things like that. But I think that these are the kind of weekends that when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, and I think that's exactly what Mercedes did. And it's just that one little tiny detail that got them a double podium finish. So for that, I'm going to give them the team of the day nod.
I think I'm generally aligned with you on that assessment in a lot of ways. One, I think Max as a complete package, he topped the timesheet in a free practice 1, free practice 2, qualifying. He didn't put a foot wrong all race. He was cool. He was tuned in. I think he looked razor focused. I would have to give him driver of the day. And I don't care that maybe he has the best car in the grid this week. He just did everything that you could possibly have asked of him. And I think as well, if I look at a team, Mercedes, they faced some adversity going into this race. Obviously, Lewis qualified relatively well. Bottas had a 3-place grid penalty. He managed to overcome that deficit and put that car on a podium. And again, it was close, and he would have lost that if the race had gone on another lap, but it didn't. And he scored the points that he needed to score to help keep this team in contention for a Constructors' Championship. So I thought that was good. Leclerc, I struggle with Leclerc, even though I really enjoyed watching him fight his way back through the pack on the back half of that race. In fact, really, the back half of that race was just really good for Ferrari. And if you flash back to France last weekend, it was a horror show for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc finished 16th, and Carlos Sainz was 11th, and we were wondering what happened to that Ferrari pace. Today was a really great result. Charles Leclerc finished 7th. Carlos Sainz finished 6th. But for me, Max, driver of the day, I don't care that he had the best car. He was perfect all weekend. And as far as Mercedes is concerned, I think they did everything that they could have been asked to do. The one caveat I have is, obviously, I really do take some exception to what Max did after concluding the race. He passes that stop line. And is this something we want to talk about later, or am I okay to quickly dive into this?
Well, let's just take a quick break, and then we'll come back, because I did want to talk on that. Talk about that. I'm glad that you brought it up. So we'll take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk about Max and his naughty antics at the checkered flags.
Jeez, I like that.
And we'll do so in just a moment. So don't go away, guys. We'll be back on the flip side. All right, well, welcome back to the show. Mark and Mark here, talking about the Styrian Grand Prix. And Mark, you talked about it. You brought it up perfectly right before the break there, just about Max. Obviously, a guy that doesn't really I don't know what the best word to describe him. I mean, he's not as dry and what do you want to call it? It's guarded as say Kimi Räikkönen is. A very emotionless.
Sure.
But I
like
mean,
that.
yeah, he's not like one of these guys that's going to be going out there and doing backflips and on the podium and stuff like that. So, for those of you that maybe didn't stick around to watch the end, what happened, what brought up some criticism was that as Max cross start finish, he pulled over close to the pit wall, right in front of where the crew was, up on the pit wall, up in the fencing, pumping fists and high-fiving and celebrating another big win for the team. Max basically brought it to a stop and then laid down some rubber on the track. It was a dangerous thing because you had some cars obviously still racing for position, crossing start finish, and it was brought up by the race director Michael Massey after the race, and he did say that they're going to let it go this time with a stern warning that if Max does something like that again, that there are going to be some repercussions. There are going to be some penalties involved, and I think this was just I think it was the heat of the moment, just getting to Max, because I mean he's usually pretty responsible. I mean he's not one of these guys to do anything kind of risky or silly like that. So a little bit out of character, but I think the race director did it in the proper way. This is not something that we've seen other drivers before do. Usually what we see is they pull up close to the pit wall, they wave, pump fists at the team members up on the wall there, and that's usually what it is. I mean, back in the day, drivers would stop, they'd pick up flags. I mean, you even remember one year at the British Grand Prix, what was it, 1992, Ayrton Senna hanging on to the side of Nigel Mansell's car to get a ride back to the pits after he ran out of fuel or had a mechanical failure right at the very last lap of the race. So excuse me, they have tightened things up, but I think this was handled in the correct way. What are your thoughts?
So I should probably clarify and provide a little bit of context off the top. I'm all for celebration in sports. I think an end zone touchdown celebration is great. I am the biggest fan of bat flips in baseball. I think baseball in its unwritten rules are kind of counterintuitive and a little bit destructive in terms of engaging and enticing and embracing new viewers. But I'm totally cool with celebration. And let's be totally honest, Formula One embraces celebration if done safely. And you know what? I'm totally cool with donuts. I'm totally cool with all that kind of stuff. I love to see it. I think it's really great. I think the fans love it. But there's also a time and a place. And I think the danger, the risk in this instance is very much the location and the timing. So to your earlier point, Max had lapped pretty much the entire field, minus his teammate and the other Mercedes cars. That means that as he finishes the race, the rest of the cars, 16 other cars, well, I guess there's 14 left, are still competing in a Grand Prix. And he crosses that finish line, basically comes to a stop, waves to the team, does a burnout, and then proceeds. The risk in a case like that is you're performing a stunt maneuver on a racetrack during a Grand Prix. And I think the concern here is that we saw something on this track very similar in 2015 in a lower formula race that involved Nicholas Latifi, when somebody in that race at the end of a qualifying session did exactly the same thing, came to a full stop or a near full stop. Latifi was still battling another driver position and plowed into the back of him. Now, we've posted this footage on Twitter because it's really the uniqueness of the fact that it happened in almost the exact same situation. Again, the context is different because, to your earlier point, Max was 35 seconds ahead of Lewis. He knew it. I think it's just more, if you're going to enforce safety, you've got to do it every single time. And obviously, I think from an FIA perspective, they jumped on it. They were very clear. There's no penalty points. There was no future grid penalty. There probably shouldn't have been. It was a warning. Because to your earlier point, Max is typically, when it comes to this type of things, he's not super showy. He's generally pretty reserved and fairly mature. So I think for them, this is a one-time situation. He was caught up in the moment. He was excited. He wanted to celebrate with the mechanics that were hanging off the wall and the rest of the team. I think just from a context perspective, it is dangerous and there's a place for it. And one of the things that I did pick up on was a lot of our Twitter followers were reaching out and they were hitting me with the DMs and like, oh, F1, they're coming down, they're cracking down on celebration, boo, boo, boo. No. The FIA, Formula One, they get it. Celebration's cool. It's just about timing and place. It was just the wrong timing and it was the wrong location. And Max gets it. And I think the FIA made it clear and we move on. But I think if there was one thing that was kind of out of character for Max this weekend, it was that. But it shouldn't take away from the fact that he had an exceptional weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. Now there are a number of things I just wanted to talk about here. I don't think we really need to talk so much about Lewis talking about how he felt it was impossible to keep up with Verstappen in what he called what was a lonely Styrian Grand Prix. I think we've kind of roundabout touched on this a couple of times, but the next quote I thought was a little bit interesting comes courtesy of the man himself, Mr. Christian Horner, team principal at Red Bull. And he says he's not really impressed with Lewis's basically conspiracy theories when it comes down to where Red Bull's finding all their pace. And I was thinking about it, and what I was thinking was that it's been interesting for all these years with the dominance of Mercedes, winning race after race, winning championship after championship. And nobody's ever really come out and sort of accused them for, cheating when it came to things like flexi wings or illegal fuel maps or whatever the case might be, right? But I think it is kind of interesting that now the shoe is on the other foot. And you see that Mercedes struggling, obviously haven't won a race in 4 races. They're behind in both championships, which is basically uncharted territory for them in the past decade almost. And when it comes to all these things, it's whatever it's brought up, they're the ones that are talking about possible protests. It's all these flexi wings, the tire pressures, whatever it is. And it was interesting. And I was thinking about it too. It seemed, I don't know if this is maybe the correct example, but it kind of reminded me of watching like the FA Cup or the World Cup or the NBA playoffs or hockey or something like that. The favorite goes out, they lay an egg, and then they're like, well, we went out there, but we had, the coach just basically draws attention from the fact that they weren't playing well. The ref made the bad call. We got screwed. Everything went the other team's way. I mean, this is sort of the same, but different. And it kind of seems to me that they're trying to deflect a little bit. I don't know if that's an accurate take, but I thought I would just throw it out there. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this are.
I think this is a great conversation, and I don't think it's necessarily productive in terms of the long-term sustainability of the sport and growing the audience. But I think the FIA and Liberty and Formula One have something of a perception issue here. And perhaps there isn't a conspiracy. And I just want to be clear that I think sometimes things can be talked into the narrative. And if questions are asked and questions are answered and people continue to talk about things and the F1 media continues to print things about a certain topic, whether there's any legitimate substance or not to that subject, sometimes it gets talked into being a real thing. And I think that's maybe what's happening here. I think the challenge is that, one, it's easy to target Hamilton with these comments as Christian Wolff has done. But if you look and if you trace back the source of those Hamilton comments, typically they come from very pointed questions trying to drill into that specific thing. It's not like somebody's coming up to Lewis and saying, hey, Lewis, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that new Migos album. And he diverts from talking about Migos and kind of spears off into this conversation about how Red Bull are circumventing the regulations and introducing new mechanical upgrades to the power unit. That's not necessarily what's happening. People are asking very specific questions like, do you think this is happening? Do you think Red Bull is happening? Or do you think it's suspicious that they're finding more power as the season goes on? So those are the type of questions that Hamilton's getting. And he's not the type of guy that is going to no comment in those instances, partly because it's not in his character, but partly because he would also be fined because he's required to engage with the media when they're asking those types of questions. I think the bigger issue here is the perception piece. One is that if you go back to the beginning of the season, and you and I talked about this at length, it was Hamilton that actually surfaced the flexing wing story. That whole storyline came, and it probably would have come out anyways. But if you recall, there was a very specific race where Hamilton was following Max and saw the wing. And then, of course, everyone starts diving into the footage and it becomes a major issue. The FIA has to get involved. The other one, too, is the pit stop technical directive from last week. We don't know, but I think we all know where that came from. And we all believe that the complaint, the concern was raised by the Mercedes team. And obviously it was because ultimately, not that it was a safety issue, but ultimately that it was a competitive advantage for Red Bull. And I think when you're Formula One teams and there's so much money on the line, sometimes you're going to push the boundaries in terms of what you can do from a technical perspective, in terms of your craft when it comes to building a race car and putting together a power unit, but also sometimes in ensuring that all of the other teams are held to the same standards, that they're on side. And I think sometimes there's a bit of this. So as much as I don't necessarily think there's a massive conspiracy here, it's not a good look for the FIA and Liberty or Mercedes when a lot of these storylines kind of get traced back to Mercedes in a way. The pit stop piece, the flexing wing, it's not a good look. And again, I don't believe there's a conspiracy. I don't believe for a single second that people are sitting at the offices of Liberty saying we need to find a way to slow down Red Bull because either we favor Mercedes or because we want a closer championship. That's not happening. And if you wanted to have those conversations, you could also dig into the fact that the new aero regulations distinctly are unfavorable to Mercedes. You could talk about the fact that the DAS system, which was a huge performance benefit to Mercedes last year, was stripped out. So I don't think there's a conspiracy. I think it's more of a perception issue. And sometimes we just talk things into being.
Yeah, it is interesting because if you read the larger quote, it basically was pulled out of a press conference which both Toto Wolff and Christian Horner attended, and this topic was brought up, and I think basically went back to some of the comments that Toto had made. I think they were misinterpreted a little bit because I think that the way that he spoke it, I don't know if maybe it was something that was in media that wasn't necessarily in English language, and there was something lost in translation. But I think basically what the original comment was that they've managed to find performance when basically it's all locked down and they can't do anything in season. And I think it was rather, I think that's where it came from. Anyways, in this press conference, Toto basically cleared the air, and Christian was actually cool with that. He said that he felt that the explanation that Toto gave in regards to all these different things was pretty much spot on. Anyways, the exact response from Christian Horner is, quote, "I think Toto's answered it very well, and I think maybe he should explain it to his driver. I listen with interest, and sometimes some of the theories Lewis has are sometimes some way from reality. I think Toto has actually summarized it very well. We run less drag and we run lower wing. Pardon me, that's a bit of a mouthful. And as a result, you tend to go a bit quicker down the straight sometimes," end quote. And that's, of course, in response to France last week with a very long Mistral straight at Paul Ricard. But again, it's easy to take these things, especially in this clickbait world that we live in, that you can take a quote or a question that's thrown out there by the media, and it can be asked of a driver or a team principal or whoever, and then it's easy just to grab that one little comment and throw it into an article, or just grab that piece of video and post it online, and lacking the larger context, it sometimes comes out meaning something completely different. And of course, like you said, Lewis might be just being asked specifically on that specific topic, and then he's going to answer it. So it is interesting, and it seems kind of funny that Christian would kind of get involved in that sort of a discussion. But it is interesting because when you look at it that way, you on the flip side, like you say, I mean, there's some very specific technical directives that have come out, like the DAS and the Aero Regs and these high rake cars and Aston Martin being another one that have been adversely affected by the Aero Regs this year. Mercedes another one. I mean, they've recovered and pivoted a little bit better than Aston Martin has, but it is a perception issue, and especially when you have all these new fans on board, I think they have to be. They're just going to do whatever they need to do, but obviously they want to do it in a way that's unbiased, that doesn't make it look like it is favoring one team over the other in whatever situation it is. Oh, hang on a sec. You forgot to unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you flag me so that listeners don't know I pulled a Zoom 101 mistake if I'm working from home for the first time ever? So I think you make a really, really, really good point, which is oftentimes the comments that we see in stories are taken out of context. I have seen, because oftentimes if I see a comment that seems a little bit suspect, sometimes I'll go back and I'll find the audio clip because I want to understand the context that comment came from. Mm-hmm. And I've seen a couple times this year where a driver has been quoted And I go back and I find that quote, and it's not even a quote the drivers made. It's that they're repeating the question that was asked of them, sometimes because they didn't hear it, sometimes because they didn't understand it. And then that is taken as a verbatim quote, as if that's their opinion. So I think we need to be very careful. And you also made a great point that the way that so much of F1 media is driven, it's this clickbait media. And the other thing that I think we're beginning to understand in this new social media world is oftentimes the stories don't even get read. The only thing that gets read is the headline or the byline. And the news that people are consuming are a single Instagram post or a single tweet. And one of the things that I've even noticed Insta or Twitter doing recently is if you go to retweet a story, but you never actually clicked on the link itself, it actually pops up a little disclaimer saying, hey, you didn't actually read the article you're about to retweet. Do you really want to do that? And from even me, because sometimes I'll get caught up like, that's a great story and I want our listeners to read it. And then I'm like, that's a great point. I should probably read the substance of the story I'm about to tell our listeners to read. So I think more than ever, I think the context is important. And I think the other point too, and this is important for all of our listeners, is this kind of back and forth in the media. This is nothing new to F1. This whole tit for tat, they're doing this, they're pushing the boundaries, this is illegal. None of this is new. But I think the main point, and I should have hit on this earlier, is I think what Christian's most sensitive to is the fact that the current engine formula is frozen. Teams cannot be bringing performance upgrades to their power units to the race. And I think where he's a little bit upset and a little bit concerned is the inference potentially from Hamilton, that Hamilton's suggesting that they're finding power through power unit upgrades, not through suspensions or aerodynamic changes or strategy. And I think that's where he's a little bit upset, because he's acknowledging we can't change that power unit in terms of internal power unit upgrades that will help us generate more top line power. That's not what we're doing. And I think that's where that sensitivity is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an anecdote, a story I want to tell. We'll do that right after we take a break here. We'll come back, and this is the perfect. It was the most bizarre press conference I've ever been in. I'll tell you guys that story in just a moment, so don't go away. We'll be right back in just a moment. Okay, well, welcome back to the show. And yes, I did want to talk or give this example of how sometimes things get twisted around a little bit. And this wasn't necessarily the way that things ended up in the media, but I'm going to step away now from Formula One. I'm going to go back to 2016 when Canada played Mexico here in a World Cup qualifier in Vancouver. It was a phenomenal evening. Mexico won the game handily. I think it was like 5-0 or something like that. But it was such just a media circus. Like I guess it's to be expected whenever L3 plays, especially when it's a World Cup qualifier or in any big tournament. Anyways, there were all these big media outlets there: Fox Deportes, ESPN Deportes. I remember at one point Jorge Campos, former player and Mexican soccer legend, walking through there because he was doing color for one of the television feeds and his whole entourage. Anyways, it was really bizarre because after the match, we were sitting down in the press gallery in one of the utility rooms, or whatever you want to call it, in the bowels of BC Place. And it was interesting because the Mexican coach came in, and I'm ashamed to admit that I can't remember the coach's name. I remember at the time he was Colombian, I believe. I'm pretty sure that part is accurate. Anyways, his English was fantastic. He came in, he was well-spoken, he was well-mannered, he answered every question eloquently, and he went to great lengths to give really detailed answers. And then the Canadian coach, who was a Spanish coach at the time, he hardly spoke any English. And it was really interesting because all the media going up, they were asking their questions, even the Mexican press asking in Spanish. Everything was being translated into English. But everything that came back from the coach, regardless what language it was being asked in, would be translated, because he responded in Spanish, and then they had this interpreter. And this poor woman, I don't know where they found her. I think she worked for the CSA. And unfortunately, she was just not really strong in Spanish. So I was sitting there with my buddy Jorge, my colleague, and he's Mexican, so obviously fluent. And there was a couple of other Mexican journalists sitting there from Fox or ESPN, whoever it was. And so they would ask a question of Flores, and he would respond in Spanish. She would translate into English, and all the English media are sitting and writing this down and recording this, and all the Spanish guys are just saying, no, that's not what he said, or not quite, or, there's just like one, because sometimes there's words that when they get there just is no suitable translation into another language. So it was just, when you were talking about the way that, some of these things sometimes lack context, that was a thing that kind of immediately popped into my mind. So completely off topic, sort of on topic, but completely off on a different tangent. But excuse me, I just wanted to share that one. But anyways, this one was also interesting. Max says that he doesn't believe with Lewis's opinion or this posturing he's taking about really sort of becoming the underdog in this title fight. Sure, he, like we said off the top of the show, he's 20 points behind, or 22 points, whatever it is now in the Drivers' Championship. But it is Lewis Hamilton. He is driving a Mercedes. He is a 7-time world champion. Yeah, things aren't really going great for him at the moment, but I don't know if I would really go as far as saying that he's the underdog. What Max was saying in an interview with De Telegraaf, a Dutch newspaper, was he was being asked about that if Lewis, or he was basically asked if Lewis was the underdog going into the race, and this is what Lewis himself was saying. So bear in mind, this is being translated from Dutch into English. Anyways, Max has to say, quote, "Did Lewis say we were a lot faster in the long runs on Friday? That's not true. He tries to play the underdog a bit, but you see it is very close. It has always been like this so far this season. You see that they have been better on Saturday than on Sunday than on Saturday, partly because they are good on tires. This is something that we need to work on," end quote. So, it's interesting too, like, especially, the way, like you said, it's a perfect example. It's like they pitched him that exact quote that the comment that is made by Lewis, so he's just responding to that. The one thing is, I haven't had a chance to go and hunt down the original Dutch article, because I'm Dutch, I'm fluent in the language, and I'd be interested to see how accurate that translation is. And the original quote being translated from Lewis into Dutch, and then being translated back to Max, and what Max's specific comments are. So just kind of interesting, how things get kind of thrown back and forth to different people at different times.
I always get a real kick out of your Dutch pronunciation because it's so perfect. I like when you lean into Dutch media. And I cannot wait till we get to Zandvoort, because I can't wait for you to integrate or incorporate more of it into the show, because one, I get a kick out of it, and two, I learn a lot, because often, and obviously I don't know any Dutch, but when I look at a word, I have a sense of how it's supposed to be pronounced in my head. And when you actually pronounce it, it's totally different. So I'm totally wrong. So I get such a kick out of that. But I think from Lewis's perspective, obviously I'm not as familiar with these specific quotes, but I think it's typically in Lewis's nature that, hey, my tires are completely shot, they're great. Or, hey, I'm down on power, he's got more power. He tends to be very, very conservative of his assessments of what's going on around him. And I like that about him. I get it. I appreciate it. I think sometimes in business, we do very much the same thing, which is, look, if we expect to have a strong quarter, talk about the fact that the quarter is going to be a struggle, and that there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of forthcoming headwinds. You know what? Help bury the analyst. Don't put the analysts in a position where they can bury you. I think what Lewis does is okay. And obviously, in this case, Max is just calling him out on what he believes he's attempting to do. And I think that's totally okay.
Yeah, totally. Next story now, going from Max to Fernando Alonso. And Fernando says that Lewis Hamilton was never unbeatable. So the quote from Fernando, who was specifically asked because Lewis has been, I wouldn't say struggling, but has not had the wins to his credit as he is used to over the previous several years. He had to say, quote, "He never was, but he used to have to beat his teammate, and now he has to beat another car, and sometimes will be faster, sometimes slower. They are both at a very high level. When the Mercedes is a little bit better on a weekend, Verstappen still does something out of the ordinary to be in the fight. And when the Red Bull is a bit better, Hamilton pulls something out of the hat and is still in the fight. They've both raised the level, and that's interesting, end quote. So I think that's actually a very insightful comment from Fernando, who obviously was teammates with Lewis way back at the start of his career. Lewis is not Fernando's. Obviously, that was not the greatest relationship. We all know more recently how bad it was between Lewis and Nico Rosberg, but it was just as bad, if not more so, between Lewis and Fernando Alonso way back in 2007, 2008, whenever it was when they were teammates. But I think that's a great point. Lewis has never been unbeatable. I mean, the one thing is that, especially over the past 8 years, he's had the best car. He's obviously been in the best team. And the thing that he's done to set himself up for success is that he's been incredibly consistent. And he's also been the beneficiary of a car that's basically been, I wouldn't say indestructible, but has had incredibly good reliability. And when you put all these things together, sure, it makes him look like he is not beatable, or he isn't, or he's unbeatable, but he always hasn't been pressed. I mean, we've seen at different times that say 2017-18, they were being pushed and challenged by Ferrari. Ultimately, they weren't able to win a championship. Then you've had Red Bull winning races here and there, but this is the first year the challenge has come, like Fernando says, from outside the team, and that's where the dynamic is different. And I think that he's raised a couple of very, very good points.
I tend to get my back up against the wall a little bit when I hear Fernando Alonso talking about
me too.
Lewis in any type of critical way, and it really goes back. You hit on it. That if you don't know, during Lewis's rookie year, he was partnered with Alonso, and Alonso had just come off back-to-back titles with Renault. So he won the World Championship in 2005. He won the World Championship in 2006. Halfway through the 2006 season, a year in which he won the championship, it became clear that he was going to depart. He was going to join Mercedes. He went to the Mercedes team expecting to have the best car and run away with the championship. He gets put up against this rookie driver who was absolutely his equal in that car, despite having no Formula One experience. The relationship was hugely destructive. And I think if you look at a lot of the analysis of that year, ultimately, Mercedes didn't win the Drivers' Championship, but they almost self-destructed internally. And a big part of that, I think a lot of people suspect, is because Alonso became so enraged and so focused on Hamilton as a target for his venom, because he went into that situation with a totally different understanding of the way it was going to play out. And it didn't play out the way he thought it was going to be. And ultimately, it opened up a door that Kimi Räikkönen walked through and took a championship. That is what it is. Now, that said, these comments aren't fundamentally wrong in a sense, which is Hamilton's car has just been so good since 2014 that there really was never a technical opportunity for another driver to compete with him. For somebody to compete with Hamilton, Hamilton would have had to make a flurry of mistakes, flurries of mistakes on the track. And if Hamilton's been anything over the last 8 years, it's been absolutely a definition of reliable. He rarely makes mistakes. And not to say that there hasn't been any, but relative to the rest of the field, given the fact that he's driving under this enormous amount of pressure in the most powerful car, he doesn't make mistakes. So the combination of a great car, the combination of really reliable, consistent drives put in that position. But I actually don't disagree that there was really never an opportunity for another driver other than his teammate to compete. And obviously 14, he competed against Nico Rosberg. It came down to the final race. In 2016, he competed against his teammate. It came down to the final race, and he didn't win. But ultimately, I think those comments are absolutely correct. But I also like the fact that in one of his comments, he talks about the fact that ultimately, some race weekends, Lewis may have the fastest car. Some race weekends, Max may have the fastest car. But ultimately, he's not just competing against a teammate anymore. He's competing against a driver on another team, really for the first time since 2013 or since 2014. And I think some of our listeners that have maybe been around a little bit longer and were around for 2017, 2018, 2019, kind of that period of peak Vettel with the Ferrari team, they may point to that.
Yeah.
But I think we always saw those teams tend to self-implode and collapse in the back half of the season for a lot of internal reasons. I don't know that we're necessarily going to see this year, but I still believe there's going to be some reliability issues. And obviously, Red Bull's not going to have this string of reliability that they've seen so far this season. But yeah, for once, I actually agree with Fernando Alonso a little bit.
Yeah, that's why I thought that quote was interesting, because it seemed very well, maybe Fernando's mellowing a little bit as he gets older, but that's why that one stood out. Now, talking about their former team, that's Fernando's and Lewis Hamilton's, I was going to say Mercedes, McLaren, that is. Sorry, now I'm getting my drivers mixed up. Lando Norris, that is, says that P5 no longer has what he calls the wow factor that it used to do. I mean, he finished P5 this afternoon, and a little bit disappointing, obviously. I mean, he got on the podium here last year, and he's been such a good driver. I can understand. I mean, this is the way that team is evolving. They are, I would say, an outside shot for a podium. I would say that they're going to be a lock, because that's just not the case. But certainly they've had a taste of success. The way that this team is really being reborn and gone through this renaissance over the past years too. And certainly when you get to the point that you've had a taste of a podium here or there, and you know that you could do it, you've done it, and you finished just off of the podium. I mean, P5 is obviously not the first podium or spot off of the podium, but it's close. It's tantalizing. So I think it's an interesting comment. I don't think that this is Lando being ungrateful in any way. I mean, he certainly finished much better than his teammate Danny Ricciardo did today. But it just goes to me, I think, the changing expectations of Lando Norris and the changing expectations of McLaren as this team continues to improve and as they continue to evolve in this modern format or version of themselves.
Yeah. I actually have a criticism of McLaren today, and I think this might be an unpopular opinion, but obviously I think we all know that Lando qualified very well. He was in a very good position. And the sense I had was that he almost waved through Sergio. He almost waved through Bottas at the beginning of this race. And I think there were some questions early on. And if you're leaning into Reddit or Twitter, there was a lot of questions about whether they were having power unit issues, whether they're down on power, whether they're having tire issues, because it just seemed like they let those two cars through so quickly. Mm-hmm. And my sense was that that's not typically how Lando functions. But I think that McLaren's approach today was really, we're not going to have the pace on this track with this setup and power unit that Red Bull and Mercedes are going to have. And that ultimately our battle this year is with Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. And it's not worth us compromising those points by battling with Sergio and Valtteri and destroying our tires and compromising our race. And I think the one frustration I had this race was I was a little bit angry that Lando and McLaren weren't willing to put up a little bit more of a fight against those two cars early on. It just it didn't seem very sporting. And I get it that they were looking at the long-term picture. And the long-term picture is, let's just try to collect as many constructors points as we can so that we finish ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. And they were successful in doing that today, obviously. And I think they see a Ferrari team that's continuing to evolve and continuing to get better. And I think they made the decision early on that we're not going to get super racy with Sergio, and we're not going to get super racy with Valtteri, because that could compromise points. We could have contact, our tires could degrade faster, and we could ultimately choke up or hemorrhage points to the Ferrari team. So to me, just in terms of the sporting nature of the sport, I didn't like the fact that they didn't give Lando the opportunity to race against those two guys. I get it in the bigger picture. I didn't like seeing that. And I know that's a little bit off topic, but it was just one of the frustrations I had with this race today.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And certainly from the spectacle of the sport, it kind of runs counter to the excitement and as fans, what we want to see. But when you look, like you say, at the bigger picture, it makes sense because they only have a 12-point lead on Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship at the moment. So the point is, like you say, they're not going to be realistically racing Lewis. They're not going to be racing Valtteri or Sergio or Max.
Not every
so
weekend.
It's not every weekend. So who knows? Maybe next weekend. Maybe if the weather turned bad, it was raining. Maybe then the things turn around, or maybe on a different track that's more suited to the McLaren. That they fancy their chances, that they can run with these guys and push them for a podium or a higher points position. It just wasn't on the cards today, but certainly it just didn't look great. That one overtake on Lando going up into turn turn 3 there, and they mentioned it right on the race broadcast. It says, well, he left the door wide open and he's looking in his rearview mirror as the car's coming up and passing him on the inside. So yeah, I get it, but I think at the end of the day that for McLaren, they obviously just weren't feeling it today. It just wasn't working. The car wasn't running the way that they wanted to. So very much like Mercedes, probably damage mitigation. Just focus on the guys that you're racing and competing against. Make sure you get more points in the red cars, and then let's try again next week. So, Mark, before we wrap it up, I do have one more piece of evidence that people within the F1 paddock are listening to the show and stealing our crap. Because this is literally what it is, because we did coin this term, I think, race 1 of the season after Bahrain. But anyways, Gunther Steiner, the Gunther Steiner, team principal of Haas, a very well-known figure in the paddock, has presented Nikita Mazepin his own personalized spinning top, which, children play with, of course. Anyways, he's dubbed it the Mazaspin. So we did mention it after race 1. Whether or not we were the first ones remains to be seen, but I had to laugh a little bit. And, to be quite honest, I think that despite all the criticism that Mazepin has had from us and from others, and deservedly so, I can see the humor in this. I can see Gunther having a laugh with this, and I have to give it thumbs up. I thought this was funny.
I love that Gunther leaned into this. I love that the team leaned into it. I loved Mazepin's reaction to this, the fact that he got a chuckle out of it. And you just know that Netflix was drooling, and they probably had a suite of 47 cameras in that room to make sure that they captured the moment, and they can build an entire episode around that. And I know we're almost done. I have one more great update that I want to share.
Go for it.
Free. This was the opening race weekend for the 2021 W Series Championship.
Yep, right.
It was a great race. Alice Powell took pole in qualifying. She put in a phenomenal race. It was tight down to the wire, despite the fact that there was a mid-race restart. She finished first. She collected 25 points. Fellow Brit Sarah Moore finished second. She collected 18 points, and the championship is underway. The one point I want to kind of reiterate, because I think this is a good juxtaposition to Formula One, where you have great drivers in oftentimes very unequal cars. In the W Series, you have great drivers in identical cars. So when you see somebody like Alice Powell, who can go in and take pole and then hold off an entire field of competitors driving the exact same cars despite a mid-race restart, it speaks to her caliber and her talent. She won a race in 2019. It was 700 days since she last took a race victory, which was fantastic. The 2019 champion, Jamie Chadwick, a little bit more of a struggle, didn't look great in qualifying. She finished sixth, so she still picked up 8 championship points. But it's great to see the W Series Championship underway. And like we've talked about a couple of times now, they will be following the Formula One series as a support series. So they'll be at 8 separate events this year. We'll see them again in a couple of weeks from now, but fantastic. I just wanted to make sure that we spoke to that, and that I encourage everyone to tune in. The races are a little bit shorter. They're super, super accessible, but it's just really fun to see a championship running spec cars. And I'm not big on spec cars, which is why I'm not an IndyCar fan. I'm not a big IndyCar fan. I'm not a NASCAR fan, but it is fun to see what open wheel racing looks like on Formula One circuits when you have a bunch of very talented drivers driving identical cars.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is cool to see the difference what a really talented driver can do in identical machinery, and then it just goes to prove that it is the person behind the steering wheel and not always the machinery. Absolutely. Obviously, if you have a great car, it helps, but just that leveling the playing field like that is really cool. Anyways, Mark, that's all I've got. We're going to basically copy and paste this one. We're just going to dub some of the parts for next week's show. I'm just kidding. We're going to be doing a completely new one next week, and I'm kind of hoping that we'll get some rain next week. I mean, we did see.
Me too.
It's kind of. I guess we're about 2 weeks earlier compared to these 2 races last year, but it was 2 very, very different race weekends at the Red Bull Ring. We had a very wet weekend, and one that was very much like we saw today. So, looking forward to it. It does seem kind of have a bit of a Groundhog Day effect, but still, hey, if it still means that we get close to the 23 races at the end of the season, I'm cool with it, and I'm looking forward to it and can't wait. But until then, that's it from behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton. Thanks, guys, for listening. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Have a great week. We'll be back on Thursday night. And until then, stay safe. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.